Hi, everyone. My name is Elise Schulman. I'm a registered dietitian and I am a master's student at CUNY School of Public Health. My semester case study is on the collapse of the Venezuelan food system, what happened and why. So Venezuela was once the wealthiest country in South America because of their lucrative oil industry. Their currency is the bolivar, and their economy has taken a drastic downturn, and now over 87% of people live in poverty, 61% live in extreme poverty. Food security defines the ability of one to access safe, healthy, and culturally appropriate foods at all times. Thus, food insecurity is the antithesis of this. And prior to COVID, approximately 9 million Venezuelans, roughly one third of the population, were food insecure. And now, post pandemic, these figures are certainly worse, although we aren't sure exactly how much worse. And the thesis of this presentation is that food insecurity is a serious issue in Venezuela, and it is the result of an array of complicated issues with no simple solution. So Venezuela once had a booming oil-based economy. President Hugo Chavez, who was in power from 1999 until his death in 2013, spent billions of dollars on subsidizing food, education, and healthcare with this oil-backed funding. And he was praised for cutting the poverty rate in half. And the oil economy began declining around 2010 due to depressed world oil prices, unrestrained spending, and an increase in crude petroleum production. And crude petroleum is more difficult to refine and thus less valuable than light crude oil. And by having an entire economy based around one non-renewable commodity, the system was always bound to be unsustainable. And ultimately, the collapse of all of these programs and the economy really occurred under Nicolas Maduro, who came following Chavez and is in power now. So to say that socialism alone caused the decline of Venezuela is a real oversimplification. One of the biggest issues was really just an over-reliance on the oil-based economy and not predicting for the fact that at some point it was going to fall down. Now the currency is basically worthless. And if Venezuela had developed a more dynamic and diverse product and service economy, it is possible that they could have sustained some functional economic activity despite depreciating oil prices. And in 2016, the central bank reported that GDP had dropped 19% and inflation had reached 800%, thus spiraling the country into a severe shortage of basic supplies like food and medicine. And now there is an exodus for these basic resources as thousands of people are leaving Venezuela daily. This crisis is spilling over into surrounding countries in the region, namely Colombia, which is already unstable and having wide-scale issues with their own government. And as you can see on this graph on the side, the migration crisis in Venezuela is set to be the biggest migration crisis by sheer numbers since the Syrian war. And so Maduro has rigged the economy to stay in power. So the bolivar at the government exchange rate is 10 to 1 to the US dollar. And the block market rate is far less worthwhile. It's worth much less. And this figure is from 2017. So we can assume that the currency is worth even less than this at this point. Venezuela has always had a rather precarious food system because they rely mainly on importation rather than production. Prior to economic collapse, Venezuela imported roughly 3/4 of their food. And because of hyperinflation, food and medicine is no longer affordable for much of the population. Many hospitals and schools have closed because they do not have the resources to feed patients and students. And there is also a gas shortage, so it's hard to physically transport these necessities. In 2016, Maduro handed over control of the food system to the military. And the military will oftentimes buy food at the government's exchange rate and then resell the food to the public on the black market using the black market exchange rate in order to turn a profit. And this is obviously a very corrupt situation, and there really is no way out of it at the moment. And so in theory, a food shortage should weaken the government, but in this case, it's actually strengthened the government because Maduro's campaign has exploited the crisis in exchanging and extorting food for votes. And so eggs and frozen chickens are subsidized by the government and they may be given out at polling stations. As you can see down here, workers will look at people's benefit cards and they use this phrase, I give, you give. So if you can prove that you voted for Maduro, you may be entitled to more resources than someone who didn't. And in some places, food purchasing is rationed using a government ID. So they might look at the last digit on on your ID card, and you may be allowed to shop on certain days based on that. And if for any reason the store in your area is closed, you may just be out of luck and have no options for purchasing. And so foreign nutrition aid is a very complex topic. Maduro has repeatedly blocked UN food aid and has limited non-governmental organizations that receive foreign and US aid. Some of these non-governmental organizations have reported having bank accounts frozen, have been harassed by the government. NGOs in Venezuela provide daily meals to about 25,000 people, and delivering aid requires a ton of resources in the form of food, fuel, manpower, et cetera. So government interference with NGOs poses a really significant problem, and governments instead need to be working with these NGOs. And the US first declared sanctions against Venezuela in 2014 under President Obama because of human rights violations. Sanctions ultimately end up really affecting the people at the bottom of society who do not have the means to go around them. The wealthy and big governments can almost always find loopholes to continue business as usual, but the people at the bottom may not be as lucky. And so sanctioning aid in the form of food and gasoline, et cetera, ultimately impacts the poor of Venezuela more than it's impacted Maduro's government and the army. So there really is no right answer on whether or not it's worth maintaining US sanctions. And so Maduro has held a long contingency policy that all food entering Venezuela must be distributed through his military channels and through his government. And that can't be allowed because that would just further the extent to which the government is able to extort their citizens for votes. And at this point, strengthening the government or providing food to people, there isn't really, it's a real catch-22, and there really isn't a great solution there. But in April 2021, the Venezuelan government finally made a deal with the World Food Program to provide meals to students. And so the goal would be to provide 1.5 million daily meals to students by the end of 2022-2023 school year. And in the short term, the goal would be to provide meals to 185,000 children by the end of 2021. And the operation will really be targeting pre-primary schools and special education schools, and will be investing in the rehabilitation of school canteens and training school staff on food safety practices in order to reach the larger Venezuelan communities. And the World Food Program will provide food kits, which are high energy and transportable at major migration checkpoints for people. And they will also be providing food vouchers worth enough for up to 3 months worth of food that can be redeemed at local shops. And the annual budget of this program is estimated to be about $190 million. And so from a public health dietitian's perspective, I want to quickly go over some of the implications of poor nutrition in the long term. A 2016 study found that 73% of the population experienced involuntary weight loss to some degree. 33% have 2 or fewer meals per day. And over 90% of those surveyed said they do not have enough income to buy food. And so eating this little results in a process called reductive adaptation, where the body begins to prioritize certain systems over others. So it'll usually shut down stuff like the reproductive system first. And in children, it can cause stunting in growth. And after that, there's marasmus and kwashiorkor are 2 different kinds of malnutrition. Marasmus is what happens when you think of wasting. It's what we typically think of when we think of starvation. Kwashiorkor has wasting as well, but it may also cause a distended belly. And that happens because of liver failure and liver breakdown. And so refeeding syndrome occurs when we feed an undernourished patient too quickly, and they start to have really unstable lab values, and this can ultimately cause death. So when you're dealing with patients coming from the brink of starvation, you have to pay very careful attention to their specific medical needs. And so this isn't just about distributing food at this point. We need well-trained doctors and dietitians, we need IV nutrients, and we need sterile equipment, because children and people in the country of Venezuela are completely wasting away, and there aren't really great prospects for fixing that right now. So just to finish off, there ultimately cannot be a resolution until Maduro is out of power. Maduro is a dictator, and Venezuela needs a legitimate government that is committed to the process of improving societal outcomes and strengthening the state's institutions, Without these factors, long-term national food security cannot realistically be achieved. And there is no easy way to do this. Sanctions to weaken the dictatorship have really not made too much of a dent in Maduro's power, and lifting the sanctions doesn't necessarily guarantee that we're going to get progressive change. So there really is no right answer there. And no one wants a coup or to go to war, as those also provide poor outcomes for public health. And Venezuela already had a relatively precarious food system prior to any sort of national crisis. They were already importing roughly 70% of their food, and they don't have the same richness in the soil as some other Latin American countries. They can grow staples like sugarcane, rice, corn, bananas, and other fruits. But agricultural productivity dropped by a lot since Maduro took office. Prior to the large oil-based economy, they actually relied a lot on coffee exports, but coffee cannot nourish a population. And the government controls a lot of the land that could be used to farm livestock, but there has not been much productive leeway actually to produce food on these lands. You need people to work, you need gas for farming machinery, you need infrastructure for processing, and without government support and funding, there is no way to really turn this around. These are some pretty serious dilemmas, and there really just is ultimately no clear way to move forward as long as Maduro's reign over Venezuela is intact. And it's going to be interesting going forward to see what happens with the collaboration between the WFP and Maduro's government. These are some pretty lofty goals, and although they are certainly not impossible, I don't really see how these program changes are going to increase long-term national food insecurity in the country. It's really geared towards children, and while this is a best-case scenario, having a goal to feed 185,000 children by the end of 2021 is really not a lot, as there are millions of children in Venezuela. There are roughly almost 30 million people in the country, and a goal to provide 1.5 million students with food by the end of 2023 may be impressive, but that does not equate to long-term food security in Venezuela. Thank you very much.